see you all here. So you can see the title is there, about spreading success beyond the laboratory. And so what it's focused on is basically not so much what are the types of messages we should be putting out there, but what can we do as researchers, how can we change practices to make sure that the things that we're testing, the different ways of communicating that we're trying to figure out, are broadly effective outside the sort of the research laboratory kind of context. So the example I'm going to lead with here to illustrate this is from this study, the constructive, destructive, and reconstructive power of social norms. So this was a study, you might not have heard of the study itself, but basically they wanted to see how can we use social norms, people's perceptions of what others around them are doing, to try and reduce energy consumption. And so what they did, they gave feedback on customers' bills, basically, showing, here's your energy use, here's what the good neighbors, the really efficient, not so much energy using neighbors around you are doing, and here's what the sort of the average of all neighbors, here's their levels of energy use. So basically, how do you stack up against the people around you? And giving you that feedback, plus also a kind of a rating in terms of smiley faces, more or less. This isn't the exact material that they looked at in their study, but they did have basically this rating of how do you compare to your neighbors, plus the smiley face if you did well, and a sad face if you did poorly, to try and make people feel like, oh, I'm doing really good, I should keep it up, or wow, my neighbors, I'm actually using a lot more energy than the people around me, I need to get my act together and, start saving energy. So that's what they did, assuming that people care about what others around them are doing. Other research had showed that that was effective at getting people to change behavior. And in the study that they did, it actually did work quite well. And so this is a quote from the conclusion. They said, despite concerns that normative interventions have an effect for a short time, the longer term results indicate that the effect of the normative messages continued to be strong even 4 weeks after the initial intervention. So I won't go into that much detail on the results, but basically there was a substantial reduction in energy use and relatively long term, still reduced energy 4 weeks after it ends, or the first thing goes in, that's pretty impressive in the sort of real world context. So this seems pretty good. We thought of a theory-based way to reduce energy, to encourage people to reduce energy use. We tested it, and it worked. But, I won't get to the but part yet. So this kind of intervention was adapted by this company, O-Power, and got covered in a few media outlets talking about how comparing people to their neighbors, this is the Christian Science Monitor, but there are several others. Basically, what it says, when you get neighbors to, compete or at least compare themselves to each other and think about what others around them are doing, it reduces energy. So basically, in terms of academic studies getting covered like this, it was a pretty successful study. But it turns out that there were problems when this was done more broadly. So this guy, Alcott, who's an economist, did a review because O-Power were adopting this intervention and were repeating, they didn't just test it once and then forget about it, they kept testing what the results were over and over. And because it's a large company, they were able to test it many times. And so he reviewed the data on 111 different randomized tests that they'd done, where they randomly selected some neighborhoods or areas to get that intervention about the social norms and some to get nothing, and tested it. So a total of 8.6 million households across all those different experiments, so a lot of data. And the effectiveness was from somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 of what they got in that initial test. So there was still an effect, it still worked a bit, but it was much smaller than what it had initially seemed like from that first trial. And that was a big change. And so this was, I thought, was a clear demonstration, because here you have something that seems really successful. You really get the opportunity to have any intervention tested like 2 or 3 more times beyond the first one, let alone 100. And this just shows when you go wider, oftentimes doesn't work as well. And one reason, Alcott talked about several reasons why you might have had this difference, but it turned out that a lot of the people in the initial test were in relatively wealthy neighborhoods where there was a lot of environmentalism, and people were sort of more responsive to this message about saving energy. And when you go out into the wider world, where people have more typical levels of wealth and enthusiasm about environmental protection, it didn't do quite as well. It still did something, but just not as good. And so this illustrates the difference between 2 key concepts that I'm going to be talking about here. One is efficacy, and the other is effectiveness. So this one, efficacy, is the idea of how effective are the things that we're doing in sort of the ideal conditions that you do your highly controlled research study in. How effectively does a message work? How effectively does a health program work? This comparison of efficacy to effectiveness, or at least that kind of language used for it, is from the literature on public health research, where this kind of stuff is very important. And effectiveness is how effective is whatever you're doing in the more typical real-world conditions, where the people you choose to do it on are maybe not as atypical as normal. The people who are delivering the intervention maybe don't have the same academic background or same level of time or resources as the people doing the original study. There's all kinds of other factors that can come in a real world context, and so that can change how effective things are quite a lot. And so this was a problem in the public health world as well, where ways to sort of increase exercise or healthy eating can be tested one time and seem really good, and then you try and implement it more broadly, and for whatever reason it doesn't work as well. And so Russell Glasgow and some co-authors came up with this idea of the Rien Framework, which is a framework for basically figuring out how do we make sure we go through a few more factors to make things effective in the real world and not just in the lab. And so these factors are reach, efficacy, adoption, implementation, and maintenance, thus spelling the word Rien. So to say what those 5 things are, so let's use the example, if you're thinking about the messages about the scientific consensus on climate change. Basically, reach is the number and representativeness of people reached by the intervention. So how many people does your message get across to, and are these typical of the broader population you want to reach, or is it just sort of the wealthy people or the educated people or something like that? So if you're doing Facebook ads about the scientific consensus, who do they reach basically? How many people? How many of the people you want to persuade see it? Is it only younger people, people who are more likely to use social media and so on? Are they the ones that see it? Efficacy is kind of the simplest one. It's the one that's usually tested in any test of efficacy. Basically, does it work? Does it change? Does the intervention change attitudes or change behavior? So if people who see these Facebook messages about global warming, do they change their behavior in any way? Do they change what they think about global warming? Adoption. This is whether people, organizations, or whoever it is that you want to actually deliver the message, do they, when you tell them, oh, can you please go and do this message is really effective, do they actually want to do it? So for example, let's say you go to the Sierra Club and say, oh, these messages about scientific consensus are really effective. Do they want to do it? Do more sort of radical activists, do they want to do it? Do more mainstream organizations want to do it? Do not sort of advocacy organizations, but scientific societies, like the National Academy of Sciences or people like that, do they want to put out this kind of message? Basically, like, out of all the people you could possibly want to be doing this intervention, do they actually want to do it or not? It's not much use having a really effective message if no one actually wants to put it out there. Greenpeace, Starbucks, etc. And also, you know, people can have different reasons for wanting to adopt it or not. Maybe the message is sort of you know, some science organizations might not want to be pressuring people to do anything differently. Some of them might want a message that's more political or, you know, more specific to current events and things that are going on right now. There's all kinds of reasons people might want to adopt or not adopt some kind of message about scientific consensus. Implementation is all about, okay, you have this intervention that you want people to do. Do they, when you get them to do it, do they actually go out and do it properly? So how well, assuming you get some people to agree to put out this intervention, this message, how well do they do it? Do they include all the parts that you want them to? So for example, let's say Greenpeace adopts the message that you've said for them to give. Do they put it out exactly like the one that you tested and found to be effective? Do they tweak it somehow? Do they follow all the, whatever the nuances are in the exact wording that you used the first time, or the exact maybe people that you displayed and pictures in the message, something like that, because changes and things like that can change how effective it is. Maybe they adjust it and it becomes better, but maybe it becomes worse. So real and human cause versus dangerous and urgent, if you're talking about 97% of scientists on what they believe, it's true that most of that number believe that global warming is real and caused by humans, but the question that number is based on has nothing to do with how many think it's dangerous or like an urgent thing that we need to deal with now. If you change it to saying that, it's not accurate anymore, so how would that go down? If you implement it that way, it's going to change what happens. And then finally, out of the REAIM, you have maintenance, which is relatively obvious. It's how long if people adopt it and start putting the messages out there, do they keep doing it? Again, if something is really effective, people adopt it, people implement it well exactly how you want, it's still not going to have much of an impact if they stop doing it a week or two after they agree to start doing it. So maybe the Greenpeace staff get bored of this campaign. They think, well, we need a new message now. Let's go on to something else. There's all these things coming up in the world that are different, that aren't connected to the scientific consensus. Maybe you want to do something else, and so then you're already not doing that message anymore. Or maybe, let's say the message was, you found a really gloomy message to be effective. If it was the most effective message out there, if people kept putting that up for a long time, even if it was being effective, the staff might start to feel gloomy themselves or lose morale and might want to give it up and put in something cheerier. So again, if something like that happened, you would get problems because then your tested effective message is not being used anymore. And so when you consider all these factors together, it can tell you different things about which intervention you ought to choose than if you just considered one thing at a time. So for example, if you just look at how effective the message is, which is oftentimes the only factor that's looked at in tests of messages, like how much does this message change behavior or attitudes, maybe message type A is A+, is really effective, and the other one, message B, is a B-. It still does something, but it's pretty mediocre. It doesn't work as well as you would hope. If that's all you're thinking about, the choice is obvious. You're going to go with A, right? But if you look at all the other factors and it's kind of not too bad, not as good as it could be, but still all right on everything else, whereas the intervention A is sort of D, no one wants to do it, no one can actually do it properly in the real world, the real organizations that are implementing it, and so on. In the aggregate, this one might actually be a lot worse. When you scale it up, use it more widely, it might not be as effective. And so in that case, you'll be better off choosing the one that seemed bad when you're just looking at efficacy, but is actually better when you look at everything else. And so an example of how this has actually been used in the public health context, because that's mainly the only context where trials have already been done, they used it to test an intervention to help people with their self-management of their diabetes. So doing various behaviors, checking your levels and so on, exercising, various things that you can do to help prevent bad diabetes symptoms from happening. And so what they did, it was 2 different programs, both taking place in Colorado, I think in different cities. One was called Diabetes Priority, which was people would take part in it during their regular doctor visits because they're regularly going in and they would do it then. And then this other one, Diabetes Health Connection, was done by an outside team, and it wasn't people's regular doctors that were applying it. It was the academic researchers, basically the people on the team who were doing this trial. And so, when you weigh up the results, basically the one, Diabetes Priority, done in the regular doctor visits, had better reach, it got a broader range of people, and it had better effects on physical activity. Like they did a statistical test, and this one it caused significant increases in actually getting out and being active. But the Diabetes Health Connection one had better adoption. And out of all the healthcare practices that they tried to get to implement this, more of them were willing to do this Health Connection one than the Diabetes Priority one. And they speculated it was because basically doctors are pretty busy and they'd rather not have to learn this program, figure out how to deliver it, spend extra time with each patient, going over all this stuff. If someone comes along and says, well, we've got this extra team to help do this program, you don't have to do a thing, they're more willing to say, sure, go out and do it. And so this helps illustrate how it can work in the real world. Basically, if you're only looking at effectiveness, if you'd only done trials to test, does this improve people's behavior and symptoms, this one will be the clear winner, the priority one, because it results in better physical activity, right? Let's do that one. But it's not so clear what you should choose when you find out about this adoption problem. Because if this is a great effective program, but only 2% or 5% of the people you want to do it are actually going to do it, then it's not going to have that much benefit on the broader scale, basically. And so, how would you apply this to communication? Well, maybe you could apply this to the social norms, energy use, energy reduction campaign that we talked about earlier. So maybe you figure out, okay, who's getting the messages? How can we get these messages out and make them more effective, maybe, with the people who are less environmentalists? How much does people's behavior change? Okay, you're always going to look at that. What can you do? So O-Power was the company that was willing to put out these smiley face feedback messages. Can we get more electric utilities to adopt it? Are other people going to be willing to do that, and so on? Who's, out of all those people, if you're getting more and more companies to do the intervention, are they willing to do it the way that's been shown to be effective, including both those smiley faces for people who do really well and the sad faces for the people who do badly? Maybe it doesn't work on the people who do badly without the sad faces, but maybe the company doesn't like doing that because they're scared of backlash, and so maybe they would just leave that off and it's not as effective as you'd hoped. And then maybe they do implement it properly, they do put in the sad faces, but then customers do respond and so they cut it straight away. So, what could you do? Is there a way of changing the program so that it's still effective, but is more likely to be maintained? So that could, if you could figure out, do research to improve those steps, it could have a broader impact, and maybe you wouldn't see the kind of reduction in effectiveness that you saw in the Alcott study. So what does this framework mean for researchers? I would argue that any scholar who's interested in having messages or interventions be broadly effective should think about the idea behind this, like how do we figure out all these extra factors involved in getting things more broadly used and more broadly effective. And if you're testing a study, if you're saying not just I'm trying to figure out what are the mechanisms behind how people receive and understand communication, but which messages are actually effective in an applied setting, then you should try to measure as many of these factors as is reasonable, even if that's only at a minimal scale. So maybe you don't do a massive rollout where you're trying to get 20 or 50 organizations to actually accept your messages, but you could at least send out a brief survey to say, hey, this is a message that we're doing. Do you think it's possible that you might want to do something like this in the future? That's not as good as actually trying to get them to adopt it, but it still gives you a rough indication maybe of how adoptable it might be. And you could do similar things with the other different factors. And besides sort of doing things to a smaller degree, I would argue that for scholars that are really interested in figuring out this issue of broad effectiveness, you should devote time to testing these factors in depth, basically. So if there are messages that are found to be effective or effective repeatedly in sort of traditional lab-based studies, well, let's see how effective they are in terms of adoption, implementation, maintenance, and all that stuff. And also, as well as that, let's start thinking about how we could design messages from the beginning to figure out, to make them, more widely adopted, implemented, and so on. So not just, let's take something we thought of and then try to figure out how to make it more widely effective, but what are the, thinking from the beginning, not just what are effective messages, but what are relatively uncomplicated messages, or narrowing our search for effective messages to the kinds of things that implementers, so people who might actually put out the message, what might they be interested in doing? Well, let's study that sort of group of messages and interventions to see which of that group is effective. So potential criticisms of the framework here. People might say that this is a matter for just practitioners only, like, okay, that broad scale implementation stuff, that's, the people who are actually in charge of putting out messages should just do that, not the scholars. We don't have time for that. There's too many things to measure, like it's ridiculous to think that you're going to measure all this stuff in every study, like nobody's got time to do that. Also, another big one is, where is the evidence that this actually works? So I have responses to those. I didn't just put them up there, but maybe you'll have more comments along those lines. So against this idea that it's just a matter for practitioners, I mean, obviously to some degree stuff like this practitioners are always going to be thinking about, but just as the point of being researchers of communication is to apply that kind of scientific approach and knowledge and sort of systematic understanding and use of theory and all that to making messages efficacious and help change behavior, those skills can be helpful in figuring out, getting systematic scientific knowledge of what helps messages get adopted, what is more likely to be implemented well versus badly, and so on. So the same skills are handy for figuring out those things as well as just message effectiveness. And also, even if all you want to do is understand behavior and your effectiveness of the messages, the interventions and so on is just a secondary concern, you want to have at least some idea that the theories that you're making up actually apply in everyday life, not just in, you don't want a theory of communication for research studies, you want a theory of communication for how people actually communicate. And so testing more broadly like this can help ensure that theories do apply in that context. The too many factors to measure criticism, basically, in practical terms, yes, it is way too much to expect that every person doing every study is going to measure all these 5 factors and do it extensively. But if you accept that it's still useful to measure more of the factors more of the time, then that's a more reasonable way of going about it. Some of the people will be able to look at all of them extensively. Some will just look at 1 or 2. But even looking at efficacy and adoption, for instance, or efficacy and implementation, that's still better than just looking at efficacy. You're still getting more information about what's effective. And to flip it around the other way, if you don't measure at least more things more often, then that's basically an argument in favor of maintaining what's known as the research practice gap, which is basically the things that are researched in the lab not being used, tested, useful to people actually doing things in the real world. And so if you're not testing more things about the real world and trying to design what you're testing better to fit with the real world at least a little bit of the time, then this gap that people have found to be there is going to stay there. It's not going to get any smaller. And then finally, where is the evidence that it works? Well, there isn't. There's no evidence that using this framework actually improves communication interventions. And I'm not going to argue that it's not important to get this evidence, because it is. Any practical way of improving these interventions, even though it sounds good, and hopefully it sounds good in theory, but the key test is like, okay, you've made this argument, now when people actually go out and measure all these things, does it get results, and is it worth the time of spending all that extra time measuring all that extra stuff? Eventually you want to see a return on that investment, basically. And even in the public health area, there's actually not as much evidence as you would like of, okay, when you go out and measure all this extra stuff, how much does it actually improve the effectiveness of all the programs? But you don't know, you don't get that evidence unless you go out and test it. Until you're going out and trying to improve these things and trying to see like what can we do to improve adoption, what can we do to improve implementation, nothing's going to change. You're not going to be able to see whether it does nothing, whether it does a tiny bit, whether it does a decent amount, but it takes a lot of effort and maybe it isn't worth it. Until you try it, you're not going to know. And the alternative is just saying, well, it's probably fine. Like, we don't need to see if this is actually a problem, if the adoption and so on is actually an issue. We'll just assume that stuff works. I don't think that's a good option either. So better to go out and find a way to try and make this work than to just give up without really trying. So in conclusion, I would argue that for urgent environmental issues or scientific issues more broadly as well, just as we want generalizable knowledge about how people think, how people communicate, how people respond to communication, We want the same kind of generalizable, theory-based knowledge about what's effective broadly at a broad scale. And I would argue that it's reasonable to debate, who's going to do the research, how many people are going to do the research, and also debate how exactly you test these different factors, and maybe the Rien framework, the specific factors, or the ways it's been done in the past isn't ideal, and there is a better way of attending to these kind of problems. But I would argue that we shouldn't say that there shouldn't be debate about whether people should care about it more. Basically, if you care about real-world effectiveness, you should care about figuring out how to ensure that and test that better. That's it.